Secure Science, my baby. So Secure Science for GCSE, which is an intervention tool and an approach to the science GCSE curriculum that allows everyone to get back on track. If you've got year 11s who are a little bit behind, or even if they're a little bit further back and they need some consolidation work, this is a really good way to cover an awful lot of ground very, very quickly, and is based on lots of cognitive science and lots of clever things which I will talk through. So on the next slide, we'll have a bit of an agenda for today. Haha, it worked. We're doing that terribly cringy next slide, please thing, sorry. So a bit of an intro into who I am and who the team are who produce this. Then we're going to have a little look at the research and look at how the research and my background and experience has kind of been put into practice into this product. Then we're going to look very specifically at year 11s in approaching their GCSEs in 2024 and look at the challenges that they've got. And then we're going to look at a fix for some of those challenges, which is Secure Science, and then how it all works and how all the pieces fit together. And there is a little bit of time for Q&A. As I say, you're not on mic, but there is the option to add things into the chat. When things pop into your mind, just add them in, because we can make it a little bit more flexible. We don't need to stick to every single slide. If you've got some really interesting and useful questions, feel free to share them. So on the next one, a bit of an intro, which is mainly about me. So although I was the author of the whole thing, it wasn't just me. The HarperCollins team and the team of authors and teachers who helped me put this together were quite expansive. Lots of people have contributed to this project over the last few years as the idea came together, and then very practically of writing some of the content and providing their input and experience. That experience is really important because there's this magic. I coined this, well, I didn't coin it, it's a particular trademark of mine, but the magic space is something which I use to explain where a lot of my ideas come from and a lot of my thinking in my general work. I work in schools around the world, and I've worked with multi-academy trusts and also in the classroom. I've been a teacher for 20 years now with lots of different experiences. And in that time, I realised there are some teachers who just get it and do it, and they walk the walk, and their kids do well, and they're all nice and calm and relaxed in their classrooms. And their students just seem to get it. The science comes to life, and they have this solid grasp of these big ideas. And when I was in the last project on science mastery, we realised that actually the answers to all of the questions were in classrooms. And that solid experience of how do we then codify that and make it into something which more teachers can access when they don't have the experience, is where you need to start kind of putting some structure and evidence around it. So that's where the research and evidence comes in. So I've got a master's in teacher education, which is about how do we get teachers to learn the and kind of assimilate the knowledge that they need to be great teachers. And somewhere in between those two things is this magic space. And when we find that magic space, we quite often find that really brilliant things happen, and you end up with students who just get it and they're really enthused about science, not necessarily going into careers in science, but they just get it and they understand the science in their lives and all of that kind of thing. So that's kind of what the overall kind of inspiration for this is: real life teachers with a little bit of structure and cognitive science behind it. Okay, so next slide is a little bit more about that knowledge piece. So teachers, I think, and this is based on research, evidence and experience, this is the knowledge quartet, which is a piece of work by Rowlands et al., which is based on maths education. Actually, there's a lot of science education research is, and they came up with these 4 sections of knowledge, and generally speaking we develop these components of our knowledge as we progress through teaching. And watching lots and lots of teachers when I was doing science mastery and then in my other work since, I think this takes about 7 years, and there is pieces of research and evidence that say the same, that reaching teacher expertise takes time, because you need to build these, and you can build elements of the more advanced knowledge whilst you're developing your foundation. So the first bit is foundation knowledge. It's the stuff of science. It's the science curriculum. It's your science knowledge, your knowledge of your subject. In science, that's quite hard because we specialise quite a lot. My degree is in pharmacology, so my human biology is amazing. Well, say that. My human biology is strong. Chemistry is quite strong. However, my plant knowledge I've not studied since I was doing my own A-levels, and going back even further into some of the physics, for example, that's not been part of my experience, and that's pretty true for most science degrees, except for a couple who do the kind of natural sciences, and they're quite rare. So we are very specialised. We also find that now we're struggling to get lots of teachers in. They tend to not have a straight up science degree. So they might have a psychology degree, they might have come over from maths, PE. There's lots of different kind of people who are with different backgrounds who are coming in. So their foundation knowledge is going to take a little bit longer to develop. The next part is the transformation part, and you can see that the transformation and connection are in tandem. So transformation is how you make what you know into what the children know. So it's transforming your knowledge of science into learning for your students. At the same time, you need to connect everything together. Ofsted are really hot on this at the moment, of sequencing the curriculum so that ideas and that kind of schema of what is science and what are those big ideas, that they all develop in a sensible way, because you can't kind of skip ahead too much if you don't understand the basics. I'll come back to that idea. And then contingency is, what do you do when something unexpected happens, and how do you make that into learning too? So your practical goes wrong, your enzymes were too hot and it didn't work, or your students get into year 11 and they've had a pandemic to deal with, so they've got gaps in their knowledge. And really skilled teachers with lots of experience can work contingently with that, and they can turn that around and they can continue to learn to get kids back on track. But it takes years, and we haven't got an awful lot of teachers who have those years of experience anymore. About 50% 56% of teachers have left by 5 years now, so they're not reaching that 5 years. So we need to put some support around them to enable them to do that much sooner, because their students need them to. As much as we can teach that lesson again next year, that kid's not going to get that lesson back. So that's kind of the impetus behind this, that kind of imperative to say, well, we know what great teachers do, we know the research about how all of this works, how can we make this accessible to more students so that they don't end up without the benefit of that teacher knowledge because their teacher is new or they haven't got a teacher, and all of those things, or lots of things have happened, like a pandemic. Okay, so that's the kind of meaty bit of the research part. This is a more practical piece. So this actually, again, came from the science mastery research, which was also my thesis, hence why I can use the intellectual property, because it was my thesis on my master's. So what we found, we basically reviewed all of the exams, all of them, for our students of the trust. And we looked at, where did they go wrong? Which bits can they not do that stops them getting the grades at GCSE? And as part of my portfolio of experience, I used to work for Ofwat, and it's not as we assume it is in terms of where those grades come from, because it's not, these things, you can do these things, you'll get that grade. We even it all out when we use comparable outcomes, and there's lots of things going on, but there is a correlation between the students who can do all of these things and the ones that do well in their exams. So as much as that's not the real reason, there's a correlation rather than causation, but as a very kind of brief rule of thumb, the students who do well in their GCSEs can do these things. So in that list, they can communicate, so they can use the technical tier 3 vocabulary, they know the technical terms, they know the science terminology, which allows them to put one sentence into one word. That allows them to be quite fluent and quite quick, and also to understand the words in the questions. We have an awful lot of tier 2 vocabulary, so not science, but still quite technical, complex language. If students don't get those, they can't then answer the question. So if you don't get the question, you can't answer it. And if you've not got the right words, you're going to waste an awful lot of time talking around the houses in the meantime. I used to work in central Manchester, lots of students with English as an additional language. Their language is actually very advanced, but their technical language comes after their advanced English conversational skills. So they really struggled because they were double translating. They were saying, right, what's that in my language? And then how do I say it? And then they had to translate it back. The key thing in all of that, there's a lovely little diagram, which I'm not going to steal from Mark, but if you can apply something to the unfamiliar, then you're generally speaking going to be able to answer most of the questions. And there's a really famous now example of this, which is the carrot gate. So a few years ago, it's actually whilst I was at Ofqual, so when I was on the Twitter feed, I'm kind of heading off these things, you'll see every year when kids come out of their exams, they say, oh, I've not been taught this, and this exam was awful. And sometimes they hit a bit of a thread, and the thread that they hit on was that they didn't know anything about carrots. So when we teach osmosis generally in GCSE biology, or the biology bits have combined, we tend to use potatoes because potatoes are cheap, they're easy to make into cork balls with the cork borers that are generally blunt that we have in school, and they work really well. So we teach it with that. We look at different concentrations of solution, and then we weigh the pieces before and after. We try and keep them the same size and shape and all of that kind of thing. And then we can make predictions about what's happened, and we can use the science to explain it. And that's fine. And we tend to use that example quite often. It's one of the key practicals for science, GCSE Science. So the students had done it. They'd done osmosis. It's not like, their teachers had all forgotten to teach them osmosis. It's a fairly chunky bit of the specification. But on the exam paper, there was a question which used carrots instead of potatoes. So this Twitter thing kicked off that we've not done anything about carrots. No, but you have done an awful lot about osmosis. You may have used potatoes, and not being able to apply stopped those students from answering the question because they couldn't see the science in the question. They could see the carrots. They couldn't see the osmosis, which is the bit that they're supposed to do. So that unfamiliar piece really tripped them up. We also want to make them into practical scientists. If you can't do practical science, then have we really taught them science at all? I would argue we probably haven't, as much as you probably don't need it for later on in life. The things that it teaches you about accurate measurement, making observations, correcting errors, all of those things are quite useful in your future academic studies, and generally you could argue life. And if you're doing a further qualification, so you're in a science or related subjects, to be able to do practical, and practical analysis and investigation is really important, particularly for university. If we don't do much of it, we hold them back. I've worked in FE and seen the students who knew the theory, got the grades, but they were not strong scientists, and it really knocked their confidence. So it's really important we do it. So maths is intertwined with science. I used to have a phrase on the wall in one of my science classrooms when I was a child, well, a teenager, that said something along the lines of biology is explained by chemistry, which is explained by physics, which is explained by maths, which is the only true science, which I quite liked, although there was lots of arguments about whether that was actually true. But being mathematical and understanding, it goes back to that communication thing. You need to understand the numeracy part of it. You need to be able to do simple procedures, mathematical procedures, fluently. You can't be pausing thinking, oh, how do I balance this equation, or how do I look at the proportions or percentages or a graph. All of those things are mathematical skills, and there is a crossover between those two subjects that we often don't take advantage of as much as we could. And we also need kids who want to be there. They want to do science, they're ambitious about science and their understanding of it. We don't want to be, in maths, we quite often hear people who say, don't do maths. We also hear quite a bit of, we don't do science. I'm not very scientific, I'm not very technical. And and it's too important for us to have kids who are switching off to that. You know, they need to understand the science in their lives for them to have a healthy and productive life. You know, they need to be able to look at the data that politicians or the media are presenting and question, and look at evidence and make informed decisions about their own health. You know, whether to have a vaccine, whether to give a vaccine to your child, etc., are really important things that are underpinned by principles of science. So we want them to connect with it, and we want them to, you know, enjoy being there. We like science, so we'd quite like our students to enjoy it too. Okay, so that's kind of what we're aiming for. Now, it doesn't always happen. So we're going to do a little poll now. Now, I've not done this on one of these webinars yet, so we'll see how well I can drive it. So that magic of getting kids to apply to the unfamiliar, because we've got knowledge which we've passed on really well, which we've enabled our students to understand, which we've sequenced over time, and we've reacted when there was a bit of a problem or something that we needed to change. And we've got these students, that's our ideal, you know, students who can apply to the unfamiliar, they're mathematically fluent, they've got a great lexicon of science language, and they are thriving in our classrooms. It's not always happening. So I am really interested to see what you see as the barriers to pupil success. So there is a little poll for you to fill in, which in theory will then show up. And then if you've got an other, so I've made some suggestions on here. Is it the amount of teaching time we've got? Is there gaps? Is there resources issues? You know, have we not got the stuff to teach? Is it teacher experience? Is it the teacher's knowledge? Is it something else? And if it's something else, can you put that in the chat, please? I'm just going to give you a second. Now, it does say that panelists cannot participate in the poll. I think that's just me though. So I'm going to leave you to it for a second. Okay, so I can't see anything. Does that then show up? I don't know, we're a small select group. Ah, excellent, thank you. So from our small select group, so I can't see anything in the chat, so I'm assuming there isn't anything there, but do shout if there is. And so we are pretty much teacher experience and gaps in pupil prior knowledge, and I think that tallies with what I see as well. I get to work in quite a lot of schools, and gaps are our big thing at the moment. So I think we actually start seeing that in the next slide. So thank you for your contribution. That's really helpful. Might come back to the chat later. So secure science has been developed because there are those gaps. What I was finding, and the approach is basically based on how I used to teach GCSE to kids who were not doing terribly well when we got to January in year 11. And I've done that a few times, far too many to admit to, without giving away my age. But what I tended to find is that if you've got relationships with students and you know your stuff, then you can reteach from January until the exam, and the students will do all right. They do have gaps, and it's a matter of building from solid foundations and basically building up what did you know about this already, give them some confidence that they do know something, then allow them to explore something. And I used to do this. It's funny that we have these quite like doodly pictures. I used to get a big piece of A3 paper and a Sharpie, and I had lots of different colours of Sharpie because I'm a teacher and I like stationery. And I would draw things out. I'm a terrible drawer, but I was quite good at kind of making what was effectively a mind map. And all I was doing was writing down key terms, key little diagrams or equations, or little pictures, and some of them were just ridiculously daft because I can't draw mainly. And that it was just a tool to help the students, because one of the things which I found, particularly when I taught at an all-boys school, is that me standing in front and teaching them and them expecting them to make eye contact was actually quite hard. So having something else to focus on and sitting beside them, rather than teaching to them, just changed the dynamic a little bit, and it just helped them to engage with it. So it's giving them little bits of content and breaking it down into sessions. We were doing these sessions after school, or these were our lessons. If we'd got into February, March time, this is what we did in our lessons: and chunk up the curriculum, make it really rich, cover everything that they need. Because Julian, who used to be head of science at AQA and onwards and upwards at AQA, said this at a conference at the Royal Society for Chemistry, I think it was, that agreed with me that if you get Key Stage 3 science, the basics, you've got the basics of GCSE, because it's a spiral curriculum. So we revisit the same ideas all the way around. We've been doing it since they were little. They've actually been learning science, and if I throw something up, it comes back down, since they were really tiny. But that's a whole other session. But the GCSE up to grade 5 is basically Key Stage 3 science. We've come across all of these ideas before. We talk about cells, we talk about the difference between plant and animal cells. We talk about, we've done all of these before. So it's literally not rocket science. Not that rocket science is hard, but never mind. So the subject knowledge is actually quite basic. But the key thing is joining everything together so that it feels accessible and they have a route through it in their mind. And sometimes there is a gap in that route and we need to fill it in. So by working with them and asking them questions about what do you already know, let's add a little bit in, what do you now know, can we tackle this question, was a really good way to get them working on it. So this was quite a revolutionary idea to some of the trusts that I've worked with, that you can actually fit GCSE Science into 30 sessions. And I'm not doing this on a whim. It was tried and tested. I've done it with about 5 different multi-academy trusts now, where they've said, we've got to January, we've done the mocks, we're not going to pass, we're not going to get enough of our kids through. And I said, you know what, you can, but you need to do it in a really efficient way that uses everything we know about cognitive science, condenses everything down, and empowers the students to have the confidence that they do know some stuff. And that's a key feature of secure science, is just empowering students and giving them the stuff where there is gaps. So all of that pedagogy, everything that I've learned over 20 years, everything that the team has learned over there, there's probably hundreds of years of teacher experience, solid science teacher experience that's gone into this, and it's everything we knew, and we've batted it around and knocked it about a little bit to make it into something where we all agreed. So it's not just me, it is backed up with lots of other teachers too, which has been, it's about 5 years in the making, this project. So it has been tested against some people who, they're not afraid of giving you feedback. So I'm lucky in that respect that I've got that. So the pedagogy and the cognitive science is all embedded within it. You don't need to learn it from scratch. You don't need to write your own thesis. You can just pick it up and run with it. And if you've got the teacher guide, it will also help you to see the whys and wherefores. You could just pick up the workbook and run and go and get started tomorrow. If you've got that workbook, you've got everything you need in one session. One of the best ways I've seen it working is a teacher who is doing it alongside on a visualizer. So the students are building this book of lovely 6-mark answers. So let's have a look at what's actually in it. So all of that idea of how do we empower students, how do we get them to have some confidence they know something, how do we get them to connect it all together, And then how do we get them to do that interleaving and the practicing and that cognitive science, the crux of cognitive science, of how do we interleave the ideas so that they keep on coming back to them and practicing, because it helps that be stored in their long-term memory then, and they become much more fluent. So the mantra that sits behind this, again, this was coined by one of the team rather than me, actually. I'd kind of say, it's this, and then we had to put it into 4 words. I'm not very good at doing that bit, hence why Colin's are very, very helpful for these things. So the first bit is think, which is that access what you already know. So students are posed a question. They're all basically chunky 6-mark questions. They've been spread out. So throughout the book, there is a 6-mark question on basically every key idea that you'd need to get a 5 in a GCSE, in combined science. So the first thing we ask them to do is look at that question, and they're doing 2 things at the same time. One is they're deconstructing the question and saying, well, what's it about? What's the topic that you need to remember when you're answering that question in your exam? And then the second bit they're doing in that think section is saying, what do I already know? So you can see the biological structures and their functions. This is obviously, a key idea, how structure relates to function in biology. They will be aware of differences in cells because they've been doing this for a really long time. So this has been done in primary. So you can just about see the 6-mark question that's there in that think section, which is about muscle cells and nerve cells, and it's basically a describe the difference between the 2. All of the questions, I'll come back to the questions and how they're constructed, but it's, okay, what do you know about cells? What do you know about nerves, and what do you know about muscles? Because you might remember something and, you've got these things. So they will know something. They will know that nerves are to do with thinking or moving. They know that muscles are to do with moving, and not all of them are, but there's a kind of intricate web of all of these questions, which makes sure they're covering everything. So that's the think part. You can also just about say, I'm going to come back to the adapt part, but there is a very, very clever digital version of this, which is asking the students the questions to define or identify what their starting point is. So there's kind of an analog version, which is in the book, and then there is a digital version, which is incredibly clever, but I'm going to come back to that because it is quite exciting and I need to explain it. So then we ask them to connect. So in connect, they are then saying, right, okay, so I know this. I know that muscles are something to do with moving. I think I remember what a cell is. And then there's 2 ways they can do that. One is in their book, there is that knowledge organizer, which you can see on that slide, and they can look it up. They can see a nerve cell, they can see a muscle cell, and they can remember some key things, and they can start to scribble down some of those ideas. So they can say, okay, so that nerve cell is quite long. It's to do with transmission of nerve impulses. Okay, so I can write that down. They're starting to practice some of that language. If they encounter a word that they don't know, there is a glossary at the back. So they're starting to connect together the language, the key knowledge, and really honing in on what they need to do for that question. Because if they're in the exam, that's basically what they're doing. What do you know about this already? And if they've got a basis of what they know and they've practiced all of this, then they'll be pretty fluent by the time they sit the exam. The other thing that you can do is there's a printout. It's basically like a card deck. So in the teacher guide, there is this little set of cards that you can see on the left of the screen there. And you could find the card which has got the muscle cell. It's basically all of the knowledge organisers broken up into individual chunks. So you can start to build an answer. If you've got students who want to be doing things and they're not brilliant at reading lots of text, then that kind of dealing out a card can be quite a good approach for them. And it's also an easily accessible task, rather than find this really complex word in a massive chunk of information, which is quite cognitively difficult. They can find a card which has got a picture, or find a card that's got that word on it, and they can manipulate it. So it's about access. Then they go on to solving it. And you can see on the right there, the solving question. What it does is break it down into the little chunks. So when you're looking at the question, really good GCSE students will say, okay, so what's the difference between them? And then they go through, well, these are the similarities, these are the differences. So both of them are animal cells. Both of them have a nucleus. Those kinds of things are second nature to students who are really well practiced. But if you're a bit rusty, if you've got gaps or there's things that you can't remember, then you need to be quite methodical about writing these things down. So it enables students to get the easy marks quite often, because you've got a way in, you've got to just do this line. And one of the things I used to find when I was in central Manchester is that students got to one of these big questions, there's all these dotted lines for them to fill in an answer. You go, can't do it, and would leave it. So this gives them a way in so that when they have got that big question, they can just access it. And when they've got smaller questions, oh yeah, I know that. What's that question asking about? Yeah, I can do that. And it's that practicing over time. Okay, so on the next one, going into a little bit more detail. Thank you. So the knowledge organisers are a visual. They're actually a broken up version of lots of Collins content. So you'll be pretty familiar with some of these if you've got the textbooks for Key Stage 3 or Key Stage 4. And they lay out everything that students will need to know about that whole topic. So not just the one question which is in that session, it also does everything else that they will need to know about that basic idea. They're broken up so that each of those 30 sessions has got the key idea, the real kind of nub of what's the science that you need to know. Because that's like your top trump card of, okay, so if I'm talking about the differences between muscles and nerve cells, for example, what you're actually talking about is how the structure relates to their function, which is a huge idea in biology and runs all the way through from little ones up to university and beyond. So it's presenting everything in one place with a key idea. Those statements of what that idea is took a really long time. So they're really, really economical use of language to help students really get it. So if they're going to have key ideas that they learn that middle bit, and they've got a kind of key to the door to most of the questions that are based on structure, function, relationship, then they've got some additional stuff that they can also use. Okay, so next one goes into a little more detail on the questions. So when they get to the solve section, this is that broken down 6-mark question. So the idea behind this is that if students can access the language in the question, and they have the language themselves because they've practiced lots of these, they've remembered what was on that knowledge organiser, and then how to break down the questions. So one of the key things that we spent a lot of time on was the command words for each type of question. So there is an explanation of this in what I used to call kid speak, which is where you take all of the key terms that are going to be used, and this is the AQA version. There is some thinking around, well, let's do some other examples. But for now, this is AQAs. And we've taken their command word, looked up how that's been used in lots of questions to make sure we've covered everything that may or may not be in their definition. And for everyone, so there's a describe, a solve, and explain, a compare, all of those are in there with a definition of what do you need to do. If you see that command word, what do you do with it? What do you need to produce? And we've made that into accessible language again, so it's easy to access. So each of the questions is then broken down. So this one says, ask you need to talk about similarities and differences, structures, muscle cells and nerve cells have in common. So that any a key to how do I address that? What do I do? So then you can see it goes into which structures do they have in common? So that's the similarities. How are they different? And then giving them a couple of perspectives. So how is the shape of the cell different? Which structures are different? So we're coming up with, is there differences in mitochondria, for example, or those dendrite things? And if you're working with students who are working through it, you can then point them back to the knowledge organiser if they get stuck, because it's cueing them with what is expected for each bit of the question that we will see that, as right, we know that don't, and they're not as practiced as we are. And then it gets them to write it all together at the bottom. And then the answers are checkable at the back, and then there's lots of different practice ones too. Okay, so next one. Thank you. So the reason I think the time is now for secure science is about gaps, and for these particular year 11s. Now this is particularly close to me at the moment because my son is in year 11. When my son was in year 7, he got a term in, and well, term and a smidge, and then COVID happened. So he'd started at high school. Primary was all plain sailing, you know, the life before COVID. You know, things happen. You might well have had some gaps, but all students do. Then we had the biggest disruption to learning that we have ever known as a profession in, you know, working memory. And the gaps that they've got are absolutely enormous. The difference between child A, child B, who might well get a very, very similar experience. They might have very different home lives. They might have very different technical, digital access. They might have, you know, very different families, cultures around learning, reading, all of those things might be different, but when they're in the classroom, they get the same experience. That then stopped. So that leveler that gave those two students with very different backgrounds parity disappeared. And they were therefore, some students thrived in lockdown. You know, they enjoyed having that independence and being able to expand and do different things and be with their family more and all of that kind of thing. But many students didn't. And the quality, when you are teaching in front of your students, you can work out where there are gaps and you can fix them immediately. That wasn't as easy during lockdown, and there was some exceptional teaching, and as a workforce, the teaching profession came into its own at that time of making sure that students were learning. However, there will still be gaps because our whole pedagogy and way of working is based on being in a classroom with a child and being able to fix things. We can't be contingent if we know a week later when we mark a student's work if we've managed that because they've not handed it in. You know, all of those things around teacher knowledge and how we make things work, lots of holes appeared in that, and it's no one's fault, but we have those gaps now, and that's what we need to be dealing with. They also didn't develop appropriate vocabulary and notations because they weren't writing in front of a teacher, so they're seeing the students work was a difficult logistical process. And developing that language and having conversations in class was much more difficult, particularly if you had technical issues or students without devices and that kind of thing. Then we have students whose mental health has been damaged, their social skills have been damaged by lockdown, and they come in and they know they have gaps, and that knocks their confidence, and they won't volunteer answers, so you quite often can't find what they know or not, and that's hard. And sometimes that comes out in different ways, but at the root of it, our students are not feeling very confident going into these exams. We also have a shortage of specialist teachers. Lots of folks have left the profession around lockdown for various reasons, and just generally that's a trend even before COVID was a thing, that there are different challenges in schools at the moment. Politically, there is lots of challenges in schools, and we don't have enough specialist teachers. So is COVID still really a problem? Yeah, it is. So the key things around that, you know, we're still rattling on about 2023, and COVID was quite some time ago now, but that knowledge in students builds from Key Stage 3. If you have gaps in Key Stage 3, when they didn't have a lot of Key Stage 3, then that's going to be a problem for our year 11s, because we can't lean back on they've had this work done already, because we don't know sometimes. We've got teacher shortages now, lots of reasons for that. The financial landscape is really different at the moment, so quite often we have gaps. So the people who are teaching our young people are either not specialist teachers, they're supply teachers. their cover supervisors, and many schools do not have enough teachers. Practical didn't happen during lockdown in many schools, so we don't have practical scientists. Our young people are not feeling very confident with their practical, and student stress is really extreme at the moment. They know they have gaps, and they are not going to have the same accommodations that happened in COVID. So where there were changes made to the grade structures around COVID, they are not going to happen. So we're back to, we need to perform exceptionally well to get a decent grade. So that's going to be quite hard, and there's differences around different nations on that, but can I speak to England on this product? Okay, so next one. So the solution is thus. So there's different ways into this. I'm going to spend a little bit of time. I'm going to go in reverse order on this because the digital platform is really clever. When I was pitching this to Collins, I actually only really wanted them to do the print stuff because I had an idea for a digital platform. And then it turned out that someone else had a much better idea that was kind of similar. So we decided to collaborate on that bit. So the print stuff is fairly straightforward, fairly traditional. There is a teacher book, which looks pricey, but it's really rich. It's a whole route through. It's lots of different ways to use it. It's all of the answers and quick tips on how to teach it. It's like a planning guide, and it will help you if you've got a teacher who is not a specialist, is on supply, has been in the building 5 minutes. There's your lesson, and it tells you about what's the misconceptions that students might have, what's the key gaps that they need to fix, and basically how to teach it. So you could have it like a script. Then there's the workbook, which is really good value. Each of them are, with the schools where I've seen this work really well, they've all had one, and the teachers had one, and they work through them from January onwards. Sometimes it's consolidation and they're doing other things if they're doing practicals and that kind of thing, because they're not quite finished on those. All the practicals are also in the book, but obviously you need to do them really. So those two are fairly traditional, but the digital platforms, they're clever. So it's worked in partnership with a company called Area 9 Lyceum, who have been doing this with their really, their experience in this field in formative assessment is exceptional. And again, it's very much based on research and evidence about how we learn, and it's been crafted into how we learn science through the Secure Science package. So it basically does, there are lots of resources that do some of these things, but Adapt is the only one that I've seen that's got all of them in one place. So you basically assess your students. So when you're teaching, generally, when I'm teaching, I'm sure you're doing the same, you formatively assess where's your starting point. So you take your topic and you ask some questions, and you do, where's my solid ground? What's the key thing that they can remember, and how far back do I need to go to build their foundation of knowledge before I can move it forward? And Adapt does that for you. So within these are 10-minute sessions, so they're really pacey. They work with the attention span that teenagers tend to have, and it will use the questions that are in there to say, okay, and it adapts. So it gives you harder questions if you're doing well, and it will give you easier ones if not. So it'll say, okay, you're here. And then it will say, okay, to move forward, so to progress, and it doesn't use those words, it does it in really clever interface ways. It will then give you the content. So all of the stuff which is in the knowledge organisers, we wrote into videos. So the little animations, I don't know if you've seen the RSA ones where there's a hand that writes it out. So it's a bit like that, but it's me talking. And my apprentice Romana made the video, and they are really good. They took a long time. They were hard work, but really fun to do. So you've got my dulcet tones, basically explaining it like I would explain it to a child with an A3 piece of paper and a Sharpie, and then he gives them that, which explains those. It interleaves all of the key words, all the maths that they need, and then it gives you another question. So you go, okay, what do you know now? So that students can then feel more confident that they've gone, oh, okay, I've learned a thing, I know more stuff now, which then gives them that meaningful success so they can move on, which is it's it's a nice way of learning an awful lot of science very quickly. And yeah, I now refuse to listen to them because the number of times I heard my own voice saying, you know, same sentence whilst it was being edited. It's a bit embarrassing, but I'm sure you won't find that. Okay, so on the next one, I think there is a last little look at basically this is everything written down, so you're very welcome to grab these slides, etc. But basically this is the structure, so I'll run through these very quickly to make time for questions. So the first bit, number one kind of key takeaway from these is that we diagnose and address gaps in knowledge. That's the key thing that Secure Science does. So we structure the encouragement, we get students to remember what they remember. You know, there is something in there, let's help them. The key idea cards are in the teacher guide and can be printed so that you've got another accessible way of doing it. If a big page of information, although it's, you know, it's been made accessible, there's always a place to go with this. There's common misconceptions support in the teacher guide, and there is immediate and specific feedback which is built into ADAPT. So you can do that as a teacher. If you've not got an experienced subject knowledge expert in front of those kids, then you can have ADAPT as well working alongside you to do that very technical part. And the questions check and embed understanding and enable students to structure their responses. Okay, next one. I'm aware of the time. Okay, connecting everything together. So coming back to that idea of students need to be able to adapt and develop an extensive and connected knowledge base, because then they can apply it to anything. So any question that an examiner's written on a particular mean day, when they've written a really solid question, they've got the key ideas. They can see that key term. They go, oh, that's about that. I know some stuff about that. Here we go. And the Connect videos do the same, but digital. So you can see a little screenshot there. That's the kind of text. So it's quite informal. And it's, as I say, it's me talking as if I was talking to a year 11. Okay, next one. With you know, terrible jokes in there occasionally. You can see where I got really tired. So key vocabulary, there is a full glossary, which is very well thought through to enable students to be able to go, oh, I don't know what that word is in bold, what does it mean? And then they've got it, quick access, it's in the back of the book. We know that Ofsted are very keen on that, because literacy and being made aware of the science literacy, those aspects are really, really important to solid science teaching generally. So with that in there, you've got a tool to make that come to life. And then next up. Okay, building confidence. These students have been through a really tough time. They have got gaps. So this gives them lots of support to make that a nice, friendly, kind process. Everything is low stakes. The answers are in there somewhere. It is quite informal. I mean, I tend to teach with quite an informal tone, so that really does come across. And they're within the ADAPT section, they can rate their confidence, which is a good way of sharing it without sticking their hand up in class if they're not feeling very confident. And it will help the ADAPT platform to tailor the content for them or adapt it. Okay, and then we are supporting teachers and tutors. You could equally use this as a tutor. Or if you were, so the academic mentors that we had in schools after COVID, some of those are still around. It is designed with non-specialists and tutors. You know, these are really fast, powerful sessions, and the resources are there for teachers who aren't necessarily a subject expert. So we've ploughed all of that expertise into the resources that sit around it. So if you've not got a specialist, grab the teacher guide and everything will make sense. You've got everything you need in one place. And it is based on what I've experienced and what success looks like in the classroom. Okay, so I think that then gives us a whole minute. So that's a bit of a summary. There's lots and lots of different resources. It depends on what's happening in your school and what it is you need, but there's probably something in the Secure Science package which will help. And there's always lots of support from Collins. You know, the team who have the direct contact with schools know their stuff and will be able to signpost you to the best solution for your students in their particular situation. Okay, so if we go, I think the next one is an invitation for questions, she says confidently. So I'm just going to turn my, oh yes, there's lots of scheduling options. I'm not sure, but so this is all in the teacher guide. There's basically a way of working through it. That accelerated approach, I'll just pause on that for a second, is if you get to Easter and you suddenly realise you've got a lot of students who are nowhere near and they're all panicking, there is a do these 10 sessions. Or if you're in the Easter holidays and you need something which is going to be really powerful and fix it, then that's going to help. It's all mapped to AQA, so you can see what's going on there. So if you've got students who are coming up to a paper and they want to know which ones to do, then you can map out a revision package for them. So if you're coming up to paper 1, then these are the ones which you need to do the night before, or just double check them and use the practice questions at the back. Okay, so I think we've just about got time for questions. So evaluation packs are available if you go through. That's nice and easy to type into your browser. And then, as I say, the folks who work with schools will be able to signpost you to the best combination for your school. So I'm just going to go on there. So in the chat, there's all of the links which you can use. Now, if you've got any questions about this or GCSE more generally, or science education more generally, we've got a couple of minutes if you've got any questions. So I'll just give you a moment to type any questions you might have, and if not, then click through the links and it'll take you to the Collins site that will help you to see what's available and what it looks like in a bit more detail. Okay, so there is one more message in there. So you've got folks who are your best point of contact at Collins to help you with any questions that you've got, any particular problems that you've got that you need a solution for. They'll be absolutely happy to help. We haven't got any questions on there, but it's been really lovely talking to you. Thank you for your contributions to the poll. I hope you enjoy Secure Science if you get it, and I'll see you again, I imagine. We're doing a few more of these over the course of the next year, and I'm around on Twitter as well. If you've got any direct questions, I'm still on Brave Teaching. Let's think about that for a second. But also the Freedom to Teach handle for Collins is also really handy. They've got lots on there. So thanks, everyone.